Welcome back to today's podcast, where I'll dive deep into the challenges, inequalities, and untold stories that shape our society. I'm your host, Ballygirl, and today I'm tackling a complex and often misunderstood issue: gang violence, poverty, and the disconnect between different social classes, particularly how the middle class often fails to understand the forces that drive some individuals into this lifestyle. We'll also take a look at how English law addresses gang-related crimes and murder charges, and why systemic inequality is often overlooked in the legal context. For many people, particularly those who've grown up in safe, stable environments, the concept of joining a gang or becoming involved in violence is unfathomable. But for those growing up in poverty or areas of deprivation, the reality is starkly different. Poverty, in many ways, serves as a breeding ground for crime. Imagine being part of a family where the choice is often between paying a rent or feeding your children, or living in a community where unemployment is the norm and legitimate job opportunities are few and far between. In such environments, crime can impede not as a moral failing, but as a means of survival. Gang involvement in particular may be driven by the need for economic security, protection, or a sense of belonging. For some young people, gangs provide what society does not: stability, status, and safety. When faced with extreme deprivation, the risks of criminal activity might seem worth it, if it means putting food on the table or avoiding eviction. As grim as this sounds, it's the reality for many. Now let's address the disconnect. Why is it that so many people, especially those from middle-class backgrounds, fail to understand or emphasize with individuals trapped in this cycle? There are several reasons for this. First, lack of exposure. Many middle-class people live in relatively safe, affluent neighborhoods, attend well-funded schools, and grow up in environments where crime isn't a part of daily life. They don't see why desperation that comes from living paycheck to paycheck, and they rarely interact with the systemic barriers that prevent upward mobility. Secondly, there's a narrative we often hear in the media. Crime, especially gang violence, is frequently portrayed in a way that simplifies the issue. You've all seen the headlines that describe criminals as thugs or gangsters, focusing on the violent actions without delving into the root causes behind them. This portrayal can feed into stereotypes that suggest individuals in gangs are inherently violent or immoral, rather than victims of circumstance. Finally, middle-class values often emphasize individual responsibility. The idea that anyone can succeed if they work hard enough is deeply embedded in Western capitalistic societies. It's easy then to assume that if someone turns to crime, it's because they chose to, rather than being driven by economic pressures or societal constraints. But this line of thinking ignores the very real structural issues: poverty, lack of education, discrimination, and limited job opportunities that can push people toward a life of crime. It's not as simple as just getting a job. When jobs are scarce, when your community lacks proper resources, or when systemic inequality keeps you trapped in a cycle of disadvantage. Now let's shift gears and talk about how the English legal system deals with gang-related crimes, particularly murder charges. In English law, murder is one of the most serious offences, carrying a mandatory life sentence. The legal framework is based on the principle of individual responsibility, meaning that regardless of social and economic background, individuals are held accountable for their actions. When it comes to gang-related violence, the courts treat murder just as seriously as they would in other contexts. There isn't a legal exemption or special defense for individuals involved in gangs, even if the crime was influenced by poverty or the need to provide for one's family. That said, there are legal defenses that can reduce or mitigate a murder charge, but these apply only under specific circumstances. Self-defense. If the accused can prove they acted in self-defense using reasonable force to protect themselves or someone else, this could lead to an acquittal. But in gang-related cases, this can be hard to prove, as violent confrontations are often seen as mutual. Diminished responsibility. This defense is available if the accused was suffering from a mental disorder at the time of the crime, impairing their ability to form intent. This could reduce a murder charge to manslaughter. Loss of control. Previously known as provocation, this defense is used when someone is provoked to the point of losing control. While it could apply in certain gang-related situations, it's not a common defense in these cases. Finally, we have the doctrine of joint enterprise, which is particularly relevant in gang-related violence. Under joint enterprise, individuals can be convicted of murder even if they didn't directly commit the act, but were part of a group where violence was anticipated. This doctrine has been highly controversial, with critics arguing that it has led to unfair convictions, particularly among young people with only peripheral involvement in gang activities. Now, while the law is primarily concerned with punishing individuals for their crimes, there's a growing recognition among scholars, activists, and some policymakers that systemic issues must be addressed if we're to reduce crime rates, particularly in areas affected by poverty. Studies consistently show that poverty, lack of education, unemployment, and social exclusion are key factors driving people into crime. But rather than addressing these root causes, many societies, including the UK, focus on punitive measures. This approach treats the symptoms of crime, but does little to prevent it from happening in the first place. To truly address gang violence, we need to look beyond the courtroom and a police station. We need to invest in education, provide meaningful job opportunities, improve housing, and offer support services for vulnerable individuals. Until these broader structural issues are tackled, the cycle of poverty and crime will continue, and the disconnect between different segments of society will persist. So, where does this leave us? There's no simple solution to the problem of gang violence and poverty. It's a multifaceted issue that requires understanding, empathy, and action on both the individual and a systemic level. While the legal system must hold individuals accountable for their actions, we as a society need to address the conditions that lead to those actions in the first place, and that starts with recognizing the role of poverty and inequality in driving crime. Thank you for tuning in to this episode. If you found today's discussion insightful, don't forget to share it with others. Thank you so much. Let's keep the conversation going, and remember, real change starts with understanding. See you next time.